Hello, all, and welcome to the Gestalt IT Rundown, your weekly look at the IT news of the week, brought to you by Gestalt IT. My name is Rich Stroffolino. I will be your host, in this wonderful IT sojourn. Joining me from across I-80 is the wonderful Ken Albone. Ken, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, and you can be my coast anytime. We can coast through this together.
Let's coast along. Actually, I like that. Co-host, coast. Let's do this. So, Ken, it wouldn't be the Gestalt IT rundown, I guess, without some kind of disputed merger or acquisition. So I hope this isn't a bad sign for what we're just about to talk about. But big news from VMware. They announced that they plan to acquire Heptio, or have acquired Heptio, excuse me. It was a private transaction. Didn't really need a lot of regulatory authority. Another week, another acquisition. They've now kind of bought into a little bit more thoroughly into the Kubernetes space and have the two co-creators of Kubernetes, Joe Beda and Craig McLuckie, now in the VMware fold. Not sure if those are bigger acquisitions than Keith Townsend. Time will just have to tell. Heptio has offered a Kubernetes subscription, not quite a managed service, a little bit more. They're very particular not to call it a managed service. It's a little bit more, hey, we're going to give you products, we're going to give you consulting, all this good stuff. So an interesting acquisition there. My question is, how are we going to see this kind of built directly into VMware? Is this about acquiring IP and personnel, or will, kind of Heptio's subscription be brought directly into VMware?
I think this is less about gaining a product than gaining the people and credibility that Heptio bring to the Kubernetes space. So VMware has tried to make a container play in general for a while now. We've seen a few versions of that, even a couple within the Kubernetes space. They've got PKS, Pivotal Container Service, for making it an easy button for deploying a Kubernetes cluster on your own, or VKE, their VMware Kubernetes engine that they run as a service. But really what they need is the mind share of the developer community. The infrastructure guys, they love VMware. They've known it for a while because it made their lives easier. The developers, they don't care. They say, I don't care what platform you're running my application on as long as it works. So if you tell them about VMware, they couldn't care less. But they know Heptio. They're excited to see what Heptio is doing. Heptio's at VMware now. Oh, well, let's see what that's all about. I think that's what the reaction VMware's hoping for out of this acquisition, I guess you should say.
And I think maybe the price kind of bellies that a little bit. I mean, it's $250 million, $250 million was the estimate. No terms were disclosed, but that was kind of the estimate based on funding routes and that kind of stuff. So not the biggest acquisition, but a lot of money. Do you think we're going to see some other kind of mindshare developer centric acquisitions if they're going to be continuing to play in the space?
They've been trying for years to get a developer mindshare, and I don't know that they've been completely successful in any of their previous attempts. I think this is their biggest salvo yet in trying to gain that. If it's successful, you'll probably see more. I don't think they're going to give up on that. I think that is their goal, that their dream is to be the developer company, but they're clearly not at this point. So I really, they hope they'll gain that. I'm sure that's what this is all about.
All right. Other big news coming out from the Wall Street Journal. They're reporting that despite all the hubbub about picking a new city for Amazon's HQ2, the company will in fact split the site between two cities. The rationale for the change being that will provide Amazon with a wider recruitment base, and as a side effect, alleviate some of the housing and transportation impacts on the selected communities. Just kind of for reference here, the proposed HQ2 was going to bring supposedly 50,000 new jobs and just take up a huge amount of real estate. So even in a city of 1 million plus people, obviously that's a huge influx of potentially new workers and require a lot of reconsideration of infrastructure and that kind of stuff. The report doesn't say which cities are necessarily being considered for this split. However, they will view these kind of two HQ2s, I guess, whatever, 2A and 2B or whatever, as all co-equal with their Seattle home office. They would all have their own separate executive and back office staffs. And the sites are expected to be announced within the next few weeks. Betting markets are favoring Northern Virginia and Dallas, so kind of giving them a little triangle across the U.S. there. Ken, is this, it's very interesting seeing that the recruitment base is kind of the consideration here. I don't know if Amazon was initially banking on, maybe the economy getting slightly worse, having a slightly higher unemployment rate, and therefore being able to pull people to, the second location. But, unemployment's, I think, below 4% right now. Is this just responding to economic realities, or were they getting some, civic pushback from some cities and just wanted to maybe make it a little easier to move into two places as opposed to one giant move?
Well, I think the first thing to mention that, if I remember correctly, in this article, it specified that this was one anonymous source. So I treat this still as a rumor at this point, because we only have one person that we don't know who they are and how credible it is. But so let's say that it is. I think the economic pressure is a good point in that, because otherwise you've got what is not exactly a gut punch, but kind of like a compromise. I think any city that was counting on getting 50,000 jobs is going to feel a little unsatisfied if they end up getting only 25,000, right? But they'll feel like they put a lot of effort into getting half of what they expected if they win this. But on the other hand, they're like, at least we didn't lose. Hey, look what we're getting. So, I'm not really sure. It's one of the things that will be on my radar. Like, is there any credibility to this? Is it going to develop this way? And if so, how is it going to be co-equal when you've got now, instead of 50, you've got 25,000, you've got the bulk of, or the largest single share of Amazon's employees still in the Seattle location. You don't have co-equal size. Are they co-equal in force if they're, smaller? Maybe, depending on what's coming out of those offices. So it's interesting. I think it makes sense to avoid the pushback, because I know a lot of folks in a lot of cities, I don't want it here. That's just going to drive up home prices. Traffic's going to be insane. And, it's going to be half as big. I guess it's not too bad. There's that to consider.
Yeah, it was like every mayor wanted, HQ2 in their city, but like every city council was against it because it's going to be a disaster for
more or less
certain wards and yeah. And so it's really interesting to see, maybe Amazon is starting to realize that, yes, everyone loves Prime. Everyone loves free shipping. AWS is super popular. They have a lot of goodwill. Let's not blow this by having a bunch of terrible stories about how they're destroying communities and killing home prices and pushing people out of old neighborhoods and that kind of stuff. Again, 25,000 is not it's not insignificant. We'll definitely have disruptive impacts depending on where they're going to be at. Again, if it does end up being Northern Virginia and Dallas, I think Northern Virginia, a lot of people are saying, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Times. He already liked hanging out kind of in the DC area, so that makes sense. Dallas is interesting to me. Obviously, the tax situation there is favorable to a lot of businesses in general. I would have thought they might want to have covered kind of all of the coasts, as it were, maybe go for something more in the Gulf, directly, as opposed to, Dallas, which is landlocked. But obviously Northern Virginia would give them access to the Atlantic. They already are on the Pacific. So, that certainly makes sense geographically, depending on, thinking of them as a logistics company, not as a cloud computing company. It will be interesting to see where
You also got to consider the cost of acquiring talent. In Texas, that's a prime location to pick up a lot of talent without having to pay a lot to relocate the people that you want, probably. So that's a good reason to have Dallas in the mix. And I'm sure there's plenty in the DC area as well. I'm not really sure, to be honest. But I am sure that played into the decision as well. So that's why it kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah. We'll see, supposedly coming in the next couple of weeks. So we will see if they embrace. But my joke here is, of course, that this is actually a ploy, right? So that the company the city that bows out of consideration because they don't want to split the 50,000 jobs is actually the true HQ2. And Jeff Bezos is the new King Solomon, evidently.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
All right. The Gestalt IT rundown. We love our acquisition news. We love our chip news. I'm a former AMD fanboy, now a jaded AMD fanboy. So, of course, when there's AMD news, we're going to cover it. AMD hopes that they're going to be building off the success of their new Zen chip architecture with the upcoming 7-nanometer Zen 2 architecture set to launch in 2019. AMD is promising twice the performance over the previous Zen designs. Zen 2 cores are expected to arrive in all of AMD's family of chips, including Ryzen, Threadripper, which still sounds like it was named by a child, and their EPYC server line. The EPYC 7-nanometer chips are going to be codenamed Rome and are now sampling with Amazon Amazon Web Service, and they're going to actually be they've actually just announced they're going to be offering an elastic compute cloud using EPYC CPUs that has a 10% pricing advantage over Intel instances. So interesting there. Some more roadmap stuff. AMD said that the 7nm plus Zen 3 architecture should arrive in 2020. That's obviously a little bit further down. They're not sampling those, so who knows when, if that they're going to hit that target. AMD not exactly known for executing, at least up to the last couple of years. AMD also announced the Radeon Instinct M160 GPU for data centers, with up to 7.4 teraflops of 64-bit floating peak performance, which is roughly on par with what NVIDIA offers in their current Volta line, although notably not a big uptick from that. So maybe AMD getting more parity there. And will also be built on the 7nm process, debuting later this year. It's interestingly also the first PCIe 4.0 GPU on the market, or will be. Historically, whenever they go to a new PCIe revision, it requires half the lanes to hit the same amount of throughput, right? Or it doubles the throughput per lane on that. So just kind of for reference there. In comparison, just to show you where Intel is at, Intel just previewed their new Cascade Lake Advanced Performance Platform, which is going to be built on their well-iterated Skylake architecture, offering 48 cores and 12 channels of DDR4 memory per kind of socket there, coming in the first half of 2019, built on their, again, 14nm process. So AMD in 2019 will be shipping something about half the transistors, half the size of Intel at this point. We're still hearing rumors of Intel moving to 10 nanometers. Obviously, good news for AMD. I'm very skeptical of that twice the performance figure there, Ken. But is there any reason not to suspect that they will continue to kind of slowly make their way into, increasingly into the server market, into the cloud computing market? Or is Intel going to play some hardball here, kind of old school style?
AMD or Intel's going to try to play hardball, but as you've mentioned, they've had trouble basically with their manufacturing process, even reaching 10 nanometers, not to mention 7 nanometers. I think this is most interesting from the enterprise perspective, just because that's what I'm most focused on, what I follow. I think it makes sense that they're getting these AWS instances running their chips. They want increased usage and availability of their products. Getting into AWS brings them exposure and credibility for those kinds of things. There's already been plenty of buzz around this platform ever since they released all these CPUs with way more cores than the Intel ones. And lots of people asking about them once they heard about Spectre and Meltdown earlier this year, of course. So I think that's all great. It's interesting to note that none of these instances being offered by AWS, at least initially, are bare metal. One of the big things that people look for when they look for a high core count and a lower socket count is, well, now I can put some application that I need to run bare metal, not in a virtual machine, on the server and get a lot of performance without having to pay a lot extra licensing. Well, you're not going to get that at this point, at least on AWS. So maybe that'll come in the future. Who knows? But I like this. I think it's cool. How well they execute on the 7 nanometer thing, I'm not sure, but it will buy them a little bit of extra breathing room in the competition over Intel. They're already kind of gaining some ground with EPYC as it stands right now in the current generation. So it can only go well or remain neutral for AMD at this point from that perspective.
Well, and I wonder by moving to a smaller process, and then their quote of having twice the performance. I don't think that's the headline there. I think what's going to be very important, especially when you're talking about cloud computing, is lower performance per watt figure, mm-hmm. right? So maybe you're not going to see literally the benchmark double, but you're going to see that benchmark stay the same at half the energy usage or something along those lines. And I think that's where they can really build some market share in not necessarily in the traditional server market, but in the cloud computing market, where you're getting, AWS or Google Cloud or whoever buying, just huge shipments of those. And just because they sip a little less power and they're just, more efficient for all of their storage containers worth of compute that they need to operate those kind of things. So
I'm sure that's a huge consideration, and they save all that power and pass some of the savings, but not all of them on to their customers. And all of a sudden they've got higher margin at lower cost. So
yeah, having a 10% price advantage means they're getting more than a 10% price advantage, for the company. So that's kind of cool there. moving on to something that we know well, working for Gestalt IT, Ken, Dropbox introduced Dropbox extensions, a set of APIs that will allow third-party apps to take direct action on data stored in Dropbox. Kind of the current state right now is there are a lot of services that can tap into Dropbox data. You can just it's like a Facebook login, right? You click on it, authorize a third party to use it. Essentially, what those APIs are doing, though, is pulling something out of Dropbox, doing something on their server, and then plopping it right back in. It's relatively seamless and not all that bad, but extensions really allows for kind of direct access to that direct action on that data in Dropbox, as well as adding some automation and notification tools integrated in as well. Initial extensions allow for editing media on Vimeo and Pixlr, editing PDFs in various services, and sending faxes with Hello Fax, because sure, maybe you're doing business in Japan. I don't know. I know faxes are still very popular there. Extensions will, this is what I've been told. I may be wrong. I've never been to Japan. Please, I'm not trying to assume anything.
I think hospitals use them a lot still, or something like that. There's some vertical in the US that still uses them way more than is reasonable.
Extensions will become available to all Dropbox users November 27th, so they're not limiting it to just business users, which is kind of cool. My question to you, Ken, is this a way for Dropbox to become a little bit less of just hey, this is a folder that we sync in the cloud, lives locally on the machine, and maybe more of becoming this kind of cloud file system? We're going to be talking next real quick about some of the things Apple announced recently, specifically the iPad Pro. One of the big complaints with that device, no file system. You have to go through their clunky Files app. Dropbox is a target for there. Is this a way to kind of to kind of mitigate some of the problems with mobile OSs becoming more popular and giving you kind of something approaching a cloud file system as opposed to just sync and share?
Well, I'll just say, first off, as an Android user, using Dropbox integrated with apps is far easier there than it is on iOS. I'll just put that out there. And I hadn't thought of that, the way you mentioned it, as a cloud file system being particularly useful on an Apple device. I just thought, my first thought was, I guess this could be kind of useful, but if they really wanted to be a cloud file system, then they really need to release an offering that's S3 compatible using Swift, because when you think cloud and storage, you think usually those object storage services, and that would be an offering that would make it more of a cloud offering, of course. Quentin Clark, their VP of engineering, said that he wants customers to make a broader use of Dropbox content beyond pure storage, though. So that's what this is aimed at. My first thought when I heard about extensions was, oh no, is this going to be adding unnecessary bloat the way that every time you get a new extension in your web browser it is? I don't think it's going to be executed exactly the same way, so hopefully we won't see that symptom as a result of enabling extensions. But I'm skeptical that it'll work out in Dropbox's favor in the long term, to be completely honest with you. I don't see it as a long developed and used feature. But I've been wrong on a lot of things in my career, so who knows?
Yeah, and they're going for kind of the easiest. I don't know if the easiest use cases, maybe the PDF stuff and the fax stuff. That's kind of like pretty low level of effort, I imagine, to kind of integrate those into there. I think it does get interesting when you're talking about doing stuff with video and photo. What that might lean into, kind of what Dropbox is talking about, moving just beyond storage, is, hey, maybe we start offering, as part of this extension, you can use some of the Dropbox compute that we have in this giant data center here, and hey, maybe your video, we can help export that video maybe a little faster, and you pay a couple cents, and kind of sideways get into being more of a cloud compute, more of a public cloud kind of use case without without a lot of the hairiness, I guess, that would come along with saying Dropbox coming out and saying that they're going to be doing that, right? I'm skeptical if that works long term, or if more than just a couple use cases for that, though, like you said.
That's a good point. I mean, I'm involved in another podcast, and I every once in a while I'm responsible for hosting, which means at the end of the day I get to transcode it before I stick it up in the Dropbox. But if I just upload it directly to that Dropbox, and then my laptop is no longer being used for transcoded, that certainly makes my night easier. So that would be attractive for me personally in that regard. So there you go. There's a good use case.
Exactly. And as alluded to, kind of our last story for the rundown today, I wrote a little bit of I guess it was an editorial on Gestalt IT, kind of looking at the impact of the iPad Pro at our Tech Field Day events. Around 2017, I started to see delegates really all of a sudden show up with tablets instead of laptops. Usually it's a bunch of MacBooks. There's like two guys that are super into their, Dell XPS, and then like the one guy or girl that will have the ThinkPad that's floating around there. It looks really cool, and I'm always very envious of ThinkPad people. You get people are awesome. Thank you. But recently, increasingly, is seeing the iPad Pro specifically. I can't even tell you name a Galaxy Tab, whatever. That's probably a thing that exists. But seeing those increasingly around the table and kind of talking to people and saying, yeah, this is really a device that's really interesting for road warriors, right? I'm not going to be doing my main office productivity here, but I need something that's super portable, super long battery life. I can do some basic input on it, even though pasting, I guess, sometimes breaks everything when it comes to that. But Apple just announced a totally refreshed iPad Pro, supposedly as, the chip is capable of performance that's close to an i7. And I'm just kind of interested in kind of looking at everything that they announced there. They announced alongside that iPad Pro, it's kind of a long way of setting this up, an updated MacBook Air, basically, hey, we finally made it a Retina thing. Now you can buy it again, I guess. And an updated Mac Mini with desktop class CPUs and Thunderbolt 3 support. I'm probably the most excited about the Mac Mini because I have this weird thing about modular Macs. I'm a weirdo, I know. Ken, I'm interested. What do you think has the biggest impact for IT pros in terms of, something for a home lab, travel? Is the iPad Pro kind of a road warrior, tech field day delegate dream computer?
Well, yeah, let's run down the list and start with the iPad Pro. You alluded to, it's still not a replacement for a laptop. It was built as a phone-centric solution born out of the iPhone. It still makes advanced workflows too cumbersome. If you want something in a tablet form factor that you can really use your productivity tools, you're probably actually going to go to a Surface, right? As long as you don't mind Windows. So I don't think that you're going to see that being used as a replacement for a laptop anytime soon. In a pinch, it works well. We've seen people use it at conferences and stuff. It's a great way to take notes or take pictures and embed them in your notes, or if you live blog or whatever it may be on the fly. Good for that, not a replacement. But that's okay. If you want a third device that fills that niche between your laptop or desktop and your phone, you've got it in the iPad Pro. I think maybe the biggest impact for IT pros will be the MacBook Air, because either they're going to want it if they're a Mac fan, or their C-level executives will go out and buy one, and now they have to support it. So that means either way, they're on the hook to do something with the new MacBook Air. The entry-level Mac Mini could be interesting. Some people, Mac fanboys especially, might use it in a home lab, but you get a lot more for your money out of, say, a few Nooks. And you run a hypervisor off of that or whatever it is you want. They're very capable for a broad variety of uses. The entry-level Mac Mini also might be a good use case in education, though we're seeing Chromebooks be really popular in education because ease of deployment and just supportability through that for any organization or institution using Google account and G Suite to center their workflow around. So yeah, I think the MacBook Air is probably the product that will gain the most attention from IT pros in this iteration, personally.
Well, and on the education front, Apple has kind of made it clear that they think the iPad, not the iPad Pro, but their 10 point whatever inch iPad is kind of their education player. At least that's what they were saying earlier this year when they came out with like the crayon pencil support thing that they have for it, which I think is interesting. I think it's easier to bring that kind of fleet management to iOS that you need, that Chrome OS does so well when you're integrated with G Suite for education. So yeah, I don't even know if the Mac Mini for broader deployments has that kind of educational use case, or that Apple even wants it there. Honestly, I think the Mac Mini as a collection of mobile parts that we don't have a use for and sell it for super cheap is probably a better education device in terms of just keeping the cost low and being that super low level entry point to the Mac OS ecosystem. Yeah, that's what's kind of remarkable to me is looking at the reviews of the iPad Pro. I think when the first one came out, everyone was like, "Look, you can do video editing on it, and it's super fast." And it was, "Oh my gosh, this tablet can do laptopy things like really well." And now it's kind of the realization, like everyone's had a year trying to use iOS with the old Mac Pro and realizing that, iPad Pro, and realizing that, yeah, the hardware may be amazing. I think one of the unsung stories in semiconductors is that Apple is making some damn impressive advancements to ARM every year.
Yes, absolutely.
But they're kind of not finding a use case for that. It's kind of being handicapped a little bit by iOS, and that's what a lot of reviews are bearing out, that even with USB-C out, being able to do really easy display out now, you still can't do external drives. You can weirdly hook it up to an Ethernet adapter, I've heard, which is hilarious. But there's a lot of uses where you can't, where that just doesn't solve all of the problems. You're absolutely right. There, you kind of have to design your workflows from scratch when you're moving to that. And
Yes.
I don't think a lot of people want to do this, especially IT pros, right?
Yeah, they've got plenty of other things to worry about, as opposed, instead of just reorganizing their work life around a new device.
Yeah.
Why would I want to do that? I can pick up a new Mac that's better, more powerful, thinner, or a Windows PC or Linux or whatever I'm using, and use the apps I'm used to and just have a better experience that way. I don't have time for a brand new way of working. I have to get my executives' MacBook Air working. So I'm going to focus on that.
Well, that just about brings us to the end of the Gestalt IT Rundown. Ken, thank you so much. This was a delightful time. Where
My
can
pleasure.
people find more of your good stuff?
You can find me on Twitter at Ken Nalbo, and I also blog on gestaltit.com and fullstackkengineer.com.
Fantastic. Yes. And you can find me on Twitter, Rich Raffolino, at Mr. Anthropology, MR Anthropology. You can also find my writing on gestaltit.com. Like I said, I had kind of a write-up looking at, iPad Pro usage at some of our Tech Field Day events and kind of what I've seen in wider industry events. So interesting. Check that out. And lots of good coverage on gestaltit.com. We'll be back next Wednesday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, with another rundown of the IT news of the week. Until then, remember, everybody, have a super sparkly day.